In 1849, a wagon arrived in Chihuahua City smelling so vile that merchants vomited in the streets. Inside were not cattle or gold, but hundreds of human scalps, drying like salted fish. The government had released a price list: 200 pesos for a warrior, 100 for a child's head. Murder had become a legal, tax-funded industry. But when the enemy vanished into the mountains and the easy money stopped, these mercenaries found a new, terrifying source for their trophies, one that would turn the government's own greed into a nightmare they never saw coming. In the blistering heat of a high noon in 1849, the dusty silence of the main plaza in Chihuahua City was shattered not by the fanfare of a military parade, but by the ominous grinding of heavy wooden wheels against uneven cobblestones. A solitary, weather-beaten wagon, pulled by a team of exhausted and fly-bitten mules, made its slow and deliberate way toward the governor's palace, cutting through the daily bustle of the market like a hearse moving through a wedding celebration. However, it was not the sight of the rough transport that made the local merchants recoil in absolute horror and cover their faces with scented handkerchiefs, but the invisible, suffocating cloud that trailed behind it like a phantom. A thick, sweet, and cloying stench of advanced organic decay hung heavy in the stagnant air, a smell so aggressive and profound that it seemingly tasted of copper and rot, instantly overpowering the aromas of spices and roasting meat that usually defined the plaza, and signaling to every living soul that something unholy had arrived from the wilderness to do business. The man holding the reins was a figure carved from the harsh geology of the frontier itself, an Irishman named James Kirker, though in these perilous borderlands he was whispered of with a mixture of fear and reverence as Don Santiago. He sat high on the bench with the casual indifference of a man delivering sacks of grain to a general store, yet his cargo was far more volatile and grotesque than anything grown in the fields of Mexico. Behind him, piled high in the bed of the wagon, sat a collection of roughly hewn wooden crates, the timber dark and stained with damp patches that had nothing to do with the morning dew or rain. From the seams of these boxes, a dark, viscous ichor slowly wept, dripping onto the dry dust of the street with a rhythmic tapping that sounded like a ticking clock, leaving a trail of biological evidence that marked his path from the savage mountains directly to the heart of civilization. He had not come to offer silver from the mines or cattle for the slaughter, but to close a contract that the state had signed in blood and desperation. When the wagon finally ground to a halt before the whitewashed walls of the government treasury, the atmosphere in the square shifted from curiosity to palpable dread, as the clerks and officials were summoned to perform their grim duty. These were men of ledgers, ink, and bureaucracy, accustomed to counting tax revenue and land deeds, yet they were now forced to confront the visceral reality of their administration's policies. With trembling hands and faces pale from the assault on their olfactory senses, they approached the vehicle to verify the delivery, their fine suits standing in stark contrast to the filth and gore of the frontier. As the first crate was pried open with the screech of rusted nails, the contents were revealed to the blinding sunlight, causing the nearest observers to retch violently and turn away in disgust. Inside, packed tight like salted fish prepared for market, lay hundreds of human scalps, their dark hair matted with dried blood and gore, strung together on long loops of rawhide that had been cured in the smoke of campfires. This grisly accumulation represented the largest single harvest of the year, a bumper crop of death that Kirker had reaped from the canyons and valleys of the Apache territories with ruthless and mechanical efficiency. Each knot on the string represented a human life extinguished, men, women, and children whose existence had been reduced to a piece of skin and hair for the sake of a bounty claim. The sheer volume of the trophy haul was a testament to the industrial scale of the violence, a mass production of mortality that turned the hunter into a wealthy tycoon of the macabre. Kirker stood by, impassive and expectant, waiting not for moral judgment but for the weighing of his goods, for he was there to exchange the biological remnants of the state's enemies for hard currency. The officials, suppressing their nausea, began the count, knowing that every item in the box corresponded to a specific entry in the government's official price list, a document that had normalized the unthinkable and codified the value of human parts. The transaction taking place in the square was the direct result of a desperate and terrifying calculation made by a government that had lost control of its own borders and had chosen to monetize murder. Unable to protect its citizens through traditional military means, the administration had decided that genocide was simply another logistical problem to be solved through the free market and outsourcing. By placing a cash value on the head of every Apache, they had transformed the act of killing from a chaotic element of war into a structured, bureaucratic business transaction, complete with receipts and audits. As the gold coins were counted out and placed into Kirker's calloused hands, the line between the civilized laws of the state and the savage lawlessness of the wilderness was irrevocably erased. The stench of the wagon was simply the smell of the new economy, a system where the government acted as the client and men like Kirker served as the pest control, paid by the pound for human extermination. 2 years prior to the gory arrival of James Kirker, the state legislature of Chihuahua had convened in a chamber thick with fear and cigar smoke to ratify a piece of legislation that would stain the soul of the region forever. They called it the Fifth Law, a bureaucratic title that sounded dry and administrative, but in reality, it was a declaration of total war that authorized the commercialization of human slaughter on a scale never before seen in the civilized world. The politicians, terrified by the relentless Apache raids that had depopulated entire villages and brought the mining industry to a standstill, felt they had no other option but to fight fire with an inferno, signing a decree that effectively transformed every indigenous person in the territory into a walking sack of gold coins waiting to be collected by anyone with a sharp knife and a lack of conscience. The grim accounting of this new statute was precise, cold, and undeniably lucrative, establishing a fixed market rate for death that rivaled the most profitable trade routes of the era. For the scalp of a verified adult male warrior, the treasury pledged to pay 200 pesos in gold or silver, a staggering sum that could purchase a small farm, a herd of cattle, or enough whiskey to drown a man's sorrows for a decade. This figure was not arbitrarily chosen, it was calculated to be irresistible, a life-changing jackpot that turned the hazardous act of hunting an Apache brave into a gamble with odds that desperate men were more than willing to take, replacing the abstract concept of patriotism with the concrete weight of heavy specie in a leather pouch. Yet, the true depravity of the Fifth Law lay not in the bounty placed on the fighting men, but in the gruesome tiered pricing system that extended the death warrant to those who had never held a lance or a bow in anger. For the scalp of a woman, regardless of her age or condition, the government offered 150 pesos, a valuation that stripped away any pretense of honorable warfare and encouraged the indiscriminate targeting of camps where mothers tried to shield their families. This clause erased the moral hesitation that might have paused a gunman's finger on the trigger, telling him that the life of a female non-combatant was a premium commodity, a high-value asset that was actually easier to harvest than the warrior who would fight back with lethal ferocity. The bottom tier of this horrific price list was perhaps the most chilling, for it placed a bounty of 100 pesos on the head of any child under the age of 14, effectively monetizing the future generation of the Apache people. 100 pesos was a fortune to a peon starving in the dust, and by placing this bounty, the state ensured that mercy became a financial liability that no mercenary could afford to entertain. It turned infants and toddlers into livestock, creating a market force where the hair of a child was weighed and paid for with the same bureaucratic indifference as a wolf pelt or a bushel of corn, ensuring that no cradle would be safe from the greed that now swept across the northern territories like a pestilence. To understand the seismic impact of these prices, one must look at the crushing poverty that defined the existence of the average laborer on the harsh frontier of the 1840s. A hard-working shepherd, spending his days in the blistering sun and his nights guarding against wolves, might hope to earn perhaps 20 or 30 pesos in an entire year of backbreaking toil. A miner risking his lungs in the deep silver veins of the Sierra Madre considered himself lucky to scrape together a similar pittance, living constantly on the brink of starvation and debt peonage. The Fifth Law shattered this economic reality, creating a perverse distortion where a single swing of a machete could yield more wealth in 5 seconds than a decade of honest, sweat-drenched labor, making the choice between working the land and harvesting humans a simple, if diabolical, calculation. The news of this blood money spread across the continent with the speed of a prairie fire, carried by word of mouth in saloons, printed in border newspapers, and whispered in the dark corners of military outposts. It triggered a migration that was structurally identical to the gold rushes that would later define California and the Klondike, but the resource being mined here was not mineral, but biological. Men who had spent their lives scratching at the dirt for a meager existence suddenly saw a path to riches that required no claim staking and no heavy machinery, only a fast horse, a ruthless disposition, and the stomach to commit atrocities that would haunt a normal man to his grave. The psychological barrier against murder was dismantled by the state's sanction, which reframed the act not as a sin, but as a civic service rewarded with the highest honors of capitalism. In response to this siren call of easy money, the dregs of society began to trickle, and then flood, into the northern Mexican states, forming a rogue army of the dispossessed and the damned. They came from every corner of the expanding American frontier and the war-torn Mexican interior, a motley collection of individuals who had failed at everything else or were running from the hangman's noose in their home territories. Deserters from the United States Army, who had abandoned their posts to avoid discipline, rode side by side with escaped convicts who saw the lawless borderlands as the perfect sanctuary for their particular set of violent skills. These were men who had burned their bridges with civilized society and found in the Fifth Law a way to legitimize their predatory instincts under the thin veneer of government employment. Among this influx of killers were men possessing a particularly dangerous pedigree, former Texas Rangers and veterans of the recently concluded Mexican-American War who found themselves unemployed in peacetime. These men were already trained in the brutal arts of irregular warfare, skilled in tracking, horsemanship, and the use of the new Colt revolving pistols that gave them a devastating advantage in firepower. Having spent years fighting Mexicans and Indians alike, they were desensitized to violence and harbored deep-seated racial animosities that made the transition to professional scalp hunting seamless and terrifyingly efficient. They brought military discipline and tactical organization to the business of slaughter, forming companies that operated with the precision of cavalry units but with the morality of wolves, turning the chaotic frontier skirmishes into systematic extermination campaigns. As these groups coalesced into gangs, the very tools of frontier survival were repurposed into the instruments of an industrial-scale harvest, changing the cultural landscape of the region. The pickaxe and the shovel, symbols of the miner and the farmer, were discarded in favor of the heavy Bowie knife and the skinning blade, which became the essential implements of the new economy. The focus of life shifted from the creation of value through agriculture or extraction to the acquisition of value through destruction, creating a parasitic ecosystem where the hunters produced nothing but death. The local blacksmith stopped forging plowshares and began sharpening long blades designed for shearing flesh from bone, while the leather workers shifted their production from saddles to panniers designed to hold the grisly trophies that would soon flow into the cities. The societal impact of this legislation went far beyond the immediate violence, as it corroded the moral fabric of the communities that hosted these bands of mercenaries. Towns that had once lived in terror of Apache raids now found themselves playing host to heavily armed gangs of foreigners who paid for their whiskey and women with blood-stained coins. The citizens were forced into an uneasy complicity, knowing that the commerce of their town was being fueled by the massacre of families in the wilderness, yet unable to resist the influx of wealth. The scalp hunters walked the streets with the swagger of kings, their very presence a reminder that in this corner of the world, life had a price tag, and the line between the lawman and the murderer had been completely obliterated by the legislature's pen. By the time James Kirker arrived with his wagon, the Fifth Law had successfully created a self-sustaining nightmare where the demand for scalps created a supply chain that was indifferent to the source of the product. The initial justification of self-defense had long been forgotten, replaced by a cold, mercantile logic that viewed every indigenous person as a walking deposit of natural resources. The bounty system had unleashed a force that could not easily be put back in the bottle, teaching a generation of men that the most profitable use of a human being was to reduce them to a dried artifact. This was the world the law had built, a place where the sun rose on hunting parties sharpening their knives and set on the drying racks full of human hair, while the government clerks tallied the cost of their safety in the currency of genocide. By the time James Kirker had fully established his operations in the Sierra Madre, his organization had ceased to resemble a mere band of outlaws and had mutated into a paramilitary corporation of death, numbering nearly 200 hardened cutthroats at its peak. This was a diverse and terrifying coalition of humanity's worst elements, comprising Shawnee and Delaware trackers who had betrayed their own kind for coin, American frontiersmen fleeing the hangman, and Mexican renegades who knew the terrain better than the wolves. They moved through the landscape not with the chaotic fervor of a mob, but with the disciplined precision of a regiment, transforming the erratic business of trophy collecting into a cold, industrial assembly line where efficiency was the only virtue. Kirker, utilizing the tactical acumen he had acquired over a lifetime of border warfare, drilled his men to view the Apache communities not as enemy combatants to be defeated in honorable battle, but as herds of livestock to be culled for their hides, creating a machine of destruction that stripped the act of killing of any remaining shred of passion or glory. The methodology of the gang was always the same, a repetitive script of doom that began with the relentless tracking of the quarry through the unforgiving topography of the high desert and mountain canyons. The indigenous scouts employed by Kirker would scour the earth for the faintest signs of passage, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of gravel, or the distant wisp of smoke that betrayed a hidden rancheria, guiding the main column of heavily armed riders with lethal accuracy. They moved mostly by night to avoid detection, wrapping the hooves of their horses in sacking to muffle the sound on the rocky ground, a ghost army navigating the darkness with a singular, predatory purpose. When a camp was finally located, usually nestled in a valley for protection against the wind, the gang would not attack immediately but would settle into a grim vigil, waiting for the circadian rhythms of their victims to render them most vulnerable. The assault was invariably timed to coincide with the gray, ambiguous light of the false dawn, that precise moment when the human body is in its deepest cycle of sleep and the sentries are most likely to be weary and blind. Kirker would deploy his men in a wide, suffocating cordon around the sleeping village, positioning sharpshooters on the high ground and blocking every potential avenue of escape with walls of waiting lead. The order to fire was never a shout, but usually a single gunshot that shattered the morning silence, instantly followed by a deafening, coordinated volley from 200 rifles that tore through the hide walls of the wickiups and the flesh of those sleeping inside. The objective in these opening moments was not to select targets, but to create a kill zone of absolute saturation, pouring thousands of rounds into the center of the camp to maximize the body count before the victims could even reach for their weapons. In the chaos that followed the initial barrage, the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, which had already been eroded by the government's price list, was completely obliterated by the gunmen. As the Apache men scrambled to defend their families and the women grabbed their children to flee, the mercenaries fired with a mechanical indifference, their eyes seeing only the floating price tags above every head. A warrior charging with a lance was worth 200 pesos, but a mother running away with a baby on her back represented a combined value of 250 pesos, an easier target that paid a higher dividend. This perverse economic incentive ensured that the riflemen often prioritized the slower, weaker targets, cutting down the fleeing women and children with a professional detachment that treated the massacre as nothing more than a high-stakes turkey shoot. When the smoke cleared and the last echoes of the gunfire faded into the canyon walls, the gang would descend from their positions to finish the work with knives and pistols, walking among the fallen to ensure no potential revenue was left breathing. This was the moment the true nature of their enterprise revealed itself, as the heat of battle gave way to the cold, wet work of the harvest. The men would drag the bodies, men, women, and children alike, into a central pile or line them up like timber, creating an organized workspace for the specialists who would perform the extraction. There was no ceremony in this, no war cries or celebration of victory, only the sounds of heavy breathing, the sharpening of steel against stone, and the dull thud of bodies being stacked, as the camp was transformed from a home into an abattoir. The process of scalping, often misunderstood in popular lore as a quick trophy grab, was performed by Kirker's men with the meticulous care of fur trappers preparing pelts for a critical market. To be accepted by the treasury officials in Chihuahua, the scalp had to be of a certain size and condition, typically including the crown of the head where the hair whorl was located, to prove it came from a human and not an animal. The mercenaries would grip the hair firmly, make a precise circular incision around the crown, and then yank the skin free with a sickening tearing sound that became the background noise of their profession. Speed was essential, but so was quality control. A damaged scalp might be rejected by a fastidious clerk, so the butchers worked with a grim focus, ensuring that the ears were often left attached to the hide to prove the age and sex of the victim, maximizing the payout for each corpse. Once the raw materials had been harvested from the dead, the gang faced the logistical challenge of preserving their perishable cargo for the long journey back to the state capital. In the searing heat of the Mexican sun, untreated human flesh would putrefy within hours, turning the valuable bounty into a rotting, worthless mess that no governor would pay for. To combat this, the gang traveled with sacks of coarse rock salt, which was generously rubbed into the raw, bloody underside of the fresh scalps, drawing out the moisture and searing the tissue in a chemical process of mummification. The salt mixed with the blood to create a dark, briny paste that coated the hands of the workers, a substance that seemed to stain not just the skin but the very air around them with the scent of a curing shed. The drying phase turned the surrounding landscape into a surreal and macabre gallery of horrors, as the treated scalps needed to be aired out to harden properly before they could be packed into crates. The mercenaries would drape the long, black hair over the branches of mesquite bushes, hang them from the pommels of their saddles, or string them up on makeshift clotheslines between trees. A breeze blowing through the camp would cause hundreds of these grim trophies to flutter and dance, creating a rustling sound that mimicked the leaves of a willow tree, a visual and auditory nightmare that signaled the gang's total dominance over their environment. The hair of a grandmother hung next to the tuft of a toddler, all reduced to indistinguishable leather goods drying in the wind, waiting to be bundled and tagged for transport. As evening fell over the camp and the fires were lit, a scene of almost hallucinatory madness would unfold, illustrating how far these men had fallen from the graces of civilization. The scalp hunters, exhausted from a day of slaughter and butchery, would gather around the roasting pits to eat their evening meal of venison or beef jerky. In a display of hygiene that would make a buzzard recoil, few bothered to wash the day's work from their hands, tearing into their food with fingers still crusted with the dried blood and saline paste of the victims they had processed hours earlier. The ingestion of their food became physically linked to the destruction of the Apache, as the residue of the dead was consumed along with the sustenance of the living, creating a cannibalistic subtext to their nightly feast. The conversation around these fires was devoid of any reflection on the tragedy they had inflicted, focusing instead on the mathematics of the raid and the distribution of shares. The men would sit with ledgers and pencils, or simply count on their fingers, tallying the days take against the debt they owed for supplies and whiskey. They argued over the age of a victim, debating whether a particularly young scalp would fetch the child's price of 100 pesos or if they could stretch the skin to pass it off as an adult for double the money. Arguments erupted not over morality, but over accounting, as if they were miners discussing the purity of gold dust rather than murderers discussing the body parts of a massacred village. This total desensitization was the glue that held the company together, a shared psychosis where the abnormal became mundane and the horrific became routine. Laughter would ring out as a man held up a particularly long-haired scalp, joking about how much the governor would appreciate the quality of the goods, while others played cards using teeth or small bones as chips. The moral vacuum was absolute. There was no room for ghosts in a mind entirely occupied by greed. They slept soundly on the ground, surrounded by the drying remains of the people they had killed, the stench of death providing a comforting familiarity that promised wealth and security in a lawless world. By the time the embers of the fire died down, the camp resembled nothing less than a portal to hell, guarded by men who had sold their souls for a government paycheck. The industrial efficiency of Kirker's operation had stripped the act of killing of its humanity, reducing the complex, vibrant culture of the Apache to a series of inanimate objects to be processed, packed, and sold. In the darkness, the only sound was the wind moving through the drying racks, a soft, whispering reminder that the scalp hunters were no longer soldiers or even outlaws, but merely workers in a factory of blood, grinding the frontier into dust for the sake of a few coins. The Apaches, however, were not the mindless savages that the government propaganda machine portrayed them to be. They were masters of guerrilla warfare with an intimate, ancestral knowledge of the unforgiving terrain. Upon realizing that they were being hunted not for territory or political submission, but for the biological harvest of their own bodies, the tribes adapted with a strategic brilliance that left the mercenaries striking at shadows. They abandoned their traditional wintering grounds in the accessible foothills and vanished deep into the jagged, formidable spine of the Sierra Madre, a vertical labyrinth of stone where the canyons were so deep that sunlight only touched the bottom at noon. In these high-altitude fortresses, the advantage of the American rifle was nullified by the sheer verticality of the landscape, and any pursuer foolish enough to follow them into the basalt mazes faced a gauntlet of rock slides, poisoned water, and ambushes that could wipe out a company in minutes without a single enemy being seen. This tactical withdrawal created an immediate and catastrophic crisis for James Kirker's enterprise, which was built entirely on the continuous flow of liquid capital. The gang was not a military unit supported by state logistics. It was a private commercial entity with staggering overhead costs that did not pause simply because the prey had disappeared. The hundreds of horses and mules required daily grain and fodder, the men demanded their whiskey and wages, and the black powder and lead for their weapons had to be imported at premium rates. As the weeks dragged on with no fresh scalps to sell, the ledger books began to bleed red ink, and the mood in the camp shifted from triumphant greed to a sullen, dangerous desperation. A return to Chihuahua City with empty wagons was not an option, for it would signal weakness to the governor and likely lead to the cancellation of their lucrative contract, leaving the mercenaries destitute in a foreign land. Faced with the prospect of financial ruin, the leadership of the scalp hunters engaged in a chilling reevaluation of their business model, stripping away the last vestiges of their supposed mandate to protect the populace. In the quiet conversations held away from the main fires, a monstrous epiphany took hold, grounded in a simple, undeniable biological fact that the bureaucrats in the capital had overlooked. The hair of the peaceful indigenous tribes who farmed the valleys, and indeed the hair of the Mexican peasantry, the peons, was indistinguishable in color, texture, and length from that of the hostile Apache. Once a scalp was severed from the skull, cured in salt, and dried in the sun, it lost all national and tribal identity, becoming a generic commodity of black keratin and tanned skin. To the untrained eye of a treasury clerk sitting in a dim office hundreds of miles away, one black scalp looked exactly like another, and the origin of the victim was a detail that vanished the moment the knife did its work. This realization marked the final descent of the gang from ruthless mercenaries into the realm of sociopathic serial killers, as they turned their predatory gaze upon the very people they had been hired to defend. Their first targets in this new, fraudulent campaign were the peaceful agricultural tribes, such as the Tarahumara, who had lived in uneasy harmony with the Mexican settlements for generations. These groups, unlike the Apache, did not maintain a constant war footing and often welcomed the scalp hunters into their villages, mistaking the heavily armed riders for protectors against the common enemy. This trust proved to be their death sentence, as Kirker's men would accept their hospitality, share their food, and then slaughter them in their sleep with the same mechanical efficiency they had used against the warriors, harvesting the hair of allies to fill the quota set for enemies. The ease with which these murders were committed and the subsequent payments collected emboldened the gang to expand their definition of prey to include the isolated Mexican hamlets that dotted the frontier. These dusty settlements, populated by poor farmers and ranchers of mixed indigenous and Spanish blood, were far removed from the centers of power and lacked any means of communication with the state capital. The physical resemblance of these mestizo villagers to their indigenous cousins was close enough for the grisly purposes of the bounty hunters, who viewed them not as fellow citizens of a republic, but as walking livestock. The gang began to stalk these remote communities, waiting for the men to leave for the fields before descending upon the defenseless houses to reap a harvest that was far safer and easier to collect than hunting Apache warriors in the mountains. To cover the tracks of their treachery, the mercenaries adopted the tactics of the very enemy they were supposed to be eradicating, staging the scenes of their crimes to look like Indian raids. They would leave behind broken arrows and discarded Apache moccasins, items they had collected from previous battles, scattering them among the corpses to mislead any potential investigators. They burned the adobe structures and slaughtered the livestock they couldn't carry, creating the chaotic visual signature of a tribal attack, effectively framing the Apache for the murder of the Mexican peasantry. This duplicity served a dual purpose. It not only concealed their guilt but also fueled the public hysteria that justified their continued employment, proving to the governor that the Indian threat was still active and that the scalp hunters were more necessary than ever. The cynical brilliance of this scheme lay in the bureaucratic disconnect between the violence on the frontier and the administration in the city. The treasury officials in Chihuahua had no forensic tools to determine the provenance of the dried skin and hair presented to them. They only had the word of the famous Don Santiago. When Kirker's wagons rolled into town laden with fresh Apache scalps, the clerks did not see the murder of their own countrymen, they saw statistical success and political capital. They paid out the gold without question, unwittingly funding the extermination of their own tax base and rewarding the murderers for reducing the state's population. The government was essentially purchasing the death of its own citizens, paying a premium for the privilege of being deceived by foreign mercenaries who laughed all the way to the bank. This pivot to murdering civilians solved the gang's economic problems instantly, as the supply of targets was now plentiful, accessible, and virtually defenseless. The dangerous treks into the High Sierra were replaced by leisurely rides to nearby villages, where the risk of taking a bullet was almost non-existent. The hunters no longer had to sleep with one eye open or worry about ambushes. They simply rode into a town, secured the perimeter, and began the butchery. The dissociation required to look a Mexican farmer in the eye, a man who might have offered them water, and then kill him for 200 pesos, required a total collapse of human empathy. Yet, the gold was real, and the alcohol it bought tasted just as sweet, so the men suppressed any lingering guilt under the weight of their bulging saddlebags. The terror that gripped the countryside was absolute, but it was a confused, paralyzed terror, as the survivors of these Apache raids often reported seeing white men among the attackers. However, these reports were dismissed by the authorities as the hallucinations of traumatized peasants or the result of confusion in the heat of battle. The racial hierarchy of the time made it inconceivable to the aristocrats in the government that white men, even rough frontiersmen, would stoop to skinning civilized Christians for profit. This prejudice acted as a shield for Kirker, allowing him to operate in plain sight, his reputation as a great Indian fighter protecting him from the reality that he had become the most prolific mass murderer in the territory's history. As the weeks turned into months, the volume of scalps delivered to Chihuahua remained suspiciously high, even as the actual Apache raids decreased due to the tribe's retreat. The sheer number of warriors being killed should have alerted the officials that something was mathematically impossible, as the gang was claiming to have killed more fighting men than the entire Apache nation possessed. But the logic of the bureaucracy was not equipped to challenge the lie. The system was designed to process payments, not to investigate the biology of the receipts. The clerks simply counted the knots on the strings, entered the figures in the ledger, and handed over the bags of coin, lubricating the gears of a machine that consumed human life and excreted profit with indifferent regularity. Ultimately, this chapter of the saga reveals the terrifying fragility of civilization on the frontier, where the rule of law was easily subverted by the rule of the market. The scalp hunters proved that when a government puts a price on human life without strict controls, it inevitably creates a market for murder that respects no boundaries of race or allegiance. The Indian fighters had become a cancer on the state they were hired to heal, eating the healthy tissue of the society to feed their own greed. In the remote canyons and dusty plazas of northern Mexico, the difference between the savage and the savior had evaporated, leaving only the butcher and his knife, working quietly under the blinding sun to turn a neighbor into a paycheck. The absolute nadir of this descent into moral abyss was reached in the dusty, isolated settlement of Galena, a town that would soon have its name permanently etched into the blackest annals of frontier history. The arrival of James Kirker and his sprawling cavalcade of 200 heavily armed riders was initially greeted not with fear, but with a profound and collective sigh of relief from the beleaguered inhabitants, who had been living under the constant, terrified shadow of Apache raiding parties for years. To the simple farmers and exhausted ranchers of the region, the sight of the legendary Don Santiago and his private army represented salvation, a tangible delivery of the government's promise to secure the northern borderlands against the indigenous threat. They threw open the gates of their community with the naivety of the desperate, welcoming the very wolves that would devour them, believing that the rough men with hard eyes and foreign accents were the shield that would finally allow them to sleep without a weapon by their bedside. Kirker, playing the role of the benevolent protector with a sociopathic ease, announced that his company had been tracking a large war party in the vicinity and required a brief respite to water their horses and replenish their dwindling supplies before continuing the pursuit. The town elders, honored by the presence of such a renowned figure and eager to curry favor with the state's most lethal instrument, insisted on hosting a grand fiesta to celebrate the arrival of their saviors. The meager larders of Galena were emptied to provide a feast, livestock was slaughtered to feed the mercenaries, and the local distillers rolled out barrels of potent mezcal and wine, viewing the expenditure not as a cost, but as an investment in their own survival. As the sun began to set, painting the adobe walls in shades of blood orange, the plaza filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses, masking the palpable tension that vibrated beneath the surface of the festivities. The atmosphere of the evening was a masterclass in deception, a macabre theater piece where the killers mingled freely with their future victims, accepting toasts and accolades with stoic nods. The mercenaries, their weapons never far from their hands, ate the bread baked by the wives of the men they were mentally measuring for the grave, and drank the wine poured by hands they would soon sever. There was a calculated cruelty in this intimacy, a delay of violence that allowed the predators to savor the absolute vulnerability of the prey, watching as the alcohol did the work of disarming the town more effectively than any threat could have. As the hours wore on and the moon rose high over the Sierra Madre, the vigilance of the townsmen dissolved into a drunken stupor, their initial wariness replaced by a sloppy, affectionate camaraderie with the Americans and Shawnees who sat at their tables. When the signal was finally given, it did not come as a shout of war, but as the ominous, heavy thud of the town's main gates being barred and locked from the inside by Kirker's lieutenants. The music died abruptly, replaced by a sudden, confusing silence that hung over the plaza for a heartbeat before the first shot rang out, executing a prominent citizen at point-blank range. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The men who had been laughing and clapping a moment before morphed into a coordinated death squad, drawing their revolvers and knives with a speed that the intoxicated locals could not comprehend. The trap had snapped shut with industrial precision, turning the enclosed square into a slaughter pen where there was no cover, no escape, and no mercy for the men who had invited the devil into their home. The massacre that followed was not a battle, for a battle implies two sides fighting for an objective. This was a systematic liquidation of the male population of Galena. The mercenaries moved through the crowd with the efficiency of butchers working a stockyard, cutting down the farmers who stumbled in confusion, their hands still raised in gestures of friendship or surrender. The roar of the large-caliber Colt dragoons was deafening in the confined space, the muzzle flashes illuminating scenes of supreme betrayal as men were gunned down by the very guests they had embraced. Those who tried to flee were met by a wall of lead at the gates, while those who tried to fight back with clumsy knives were overwhelmed by the sheer professional violence of the scalp hunters, who fought with the detached brutality of men merely punching a time card. As the bodies piled up on the cobblestones, the true horror of the night began, revealing the economic motive that drove this treachery. The mercenaries did not just kill, they immediately set to work harvesting the commodity for which the government paid so well. Men who were still gasping their last breaths were grabbed by the hair, their heads yanked back to expose the hairline for the knife, as the hunters collected the Apache trophies that would replenish their coffers. The scalps of the Mexican farmers, thick and black, were indistinguishable from those of the enemy in the dim light, and in the eyes of the killers, these were not neighbors or allies, but simply 200 peso vouchers waiting to be cashed. The plaza, which had smelled of roast pork and sage an hour earlier, now reeked of copper blood and the bowels of the dying, a sensory nightmare that signaled the total collapse of civilization. The screaming of the women and children, who were largely spared the knife but forced to witness the annihilation of their fathers and husbands, provided a harrowing soundtrack to the grisly commerce. They watched in paralyzed shock as the protectors moved from corpse to corpse, wiping their blades on the clothes of the dead and tossing the bloody patches of skin into sacks like harvested corn. The laughter of the mercenaries, fueled by adrenaline and the absurdity of the carnage, cut through the wails of the bereaved, a sound of pure madness that acknowledged that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. They knew that by morning they would have to spin a narrative to justify this, but in the heat of the moment, they reveled in the raw power of life and death, the ultimate authority of the men with the gun. The logic behind this atrocity was rooted in a terrifying pragmatism. The fear the gang inspired was now so absolute that it superseded the truth. Kirker and his men calculated that no survivor in Galena would dare to ride to Chihuahua and accuse the famous Indian fighters of mass murder, for to do so would be to invite the gang back to finish the job. Furthermore, the dead men could not speak, and their scalps, once cured and dried, would be presented to the governor as evidence of a massive victory against a hidden Apache cell that had supposedly infiltrated the town. The narrative was already being constructed even as the blood was still wet. The town had been harboring spies, or the Indians were actually Mexican sympathizers, or perhaps the victims were simply caught in the crossfire of a heroic defense. By the time the sun rose over Galena the following morning, the town had been effectively erased as a functioning community, reduced to a collection of weeping widows and a plaza stained indelibly with the evidence of the crime. The gang rode out through the gates they had unbarred, their saddlebags bulging with the wet, heavy weight of their harvest, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than the grave. They did not flee like criminals, they departed with the arrogance of conquerors, knowing that the state government, desperate for results, would not look too closely at the origins of the hair they brought in. The Apache threat had been neutralized in Galena, not because the Apaches were there, but because the scalp hunters needed them to be there, and in the twisted economy of the Fifth Law, a dead Mexican was just as profitable as a dead hostile. This event marked the final death of the soul of the frontier, proving that the greatest danger to the settlers was not the savage in the wilderness, but the unchecked greed of their own civilization. The massacre at Galena was not an anomaly, but the inevitable conclusion of a policy that commodified human body parts, creating a market where demand created its own supply, regardless of the source. As the wagons trundled back toward the capital, carrying the remains of the men who had hosted the feast, the line between the lawman, the soldier, and the serial killer had vanished completely, leaving only the grim reality of the price list. The fear of Kirker's men ensured that the official story would be one of heroism, while the truth was buried in the mass graves of a town that learned too late that on the border, protection is just another word for extortion. The final act of this macabre tragedy played out not on the blood-soaked ground of a massacre site, but in the quiet, dust-mote-filled silence of the bureaucratic offices where the consequences of the state's madness were finally tallied. James Kirker, the architect of the industrial slaughter, sensed the shifting winds of fortune with the instinct of a coyote that knows when the carcass has been picked clean and the trap is about to snap shut. In late 1850, as rumors of his treachery began to circulate and the treasury's coffers ran dry, the Irishman gathered his ill-gotten fortune, a king's ransom in silver and gold that was literally washed in the blood of the innocent, and slipped across the border one last time. He did not flee as a fugitive running into the night, but departed with the arrogant stride of a successful businessman retiring after a profitable venture, leaving the wreckage of northern Mexico behind him in a cloud of dust as he set his sights on the booming gold fields of California. Kirker settled comfortably in Contra Costa County, near the shadow of Mount Diablo, where he utilized the wealth extracted from the scalps of Mexican citizens to establish himself as a respectable rancher and a man of substance. In a bitter twist of historical irony, the man who had presided over the butchery of hundreds of women and children was not hunted down by vengeful lawmen or haunted by the ghosts of his victims, but was instead embraced by the new society of the American West. He lived out his remaining days in relative peace, surrounded by the comforts of civilization, occasionally recounting sanitized versions of his exploits to eager listeners who saw him only as a rugged pioneer and Indian fighter. When he eventually died in his bed in 1852, he left behind a legacy that was celebrated in local obituaries, a final insult to the anonymous thousands whose biological remains had paid for his cattle, his land, and the roof over his head. However, back in the scorched territories of Chihuahua, the government that had hired him was left to grapple with a devastation that extended far beyond the empty villages and the weeping widows. As the hysteria of the Indian War began to subside and the adrenaline of the bounty craze faded, the state officials were forced to conduct a retrospective audit of the treasury to understand why the region was bankrupt. The clerks, men with ink-stained fingers and weary eyes, began the laborious process of cross-referencing the payout receipts from 1849 against the demographic records and the military intelligence reports regarding the Apache population. What they discovered in the quiet of the archives was a mathematical impossibility so staggering that it initially seemed like a clerical error, a statistical anomaly that defied all logic and reason. The ledgers revealed that in the span of a single calendar year, the state of Chihuahua had paid out bounties for a number of scalps that exceeded the total estimated population of every Apache man, woman, and child in North America. The sheer volume of hair that had been purchased by the government was biologically impossible if one assumed that the targets were solely hostile indigenous warriors, or even hostile indigenous civilians. The numbers painted a terrifying picture of a fraud so massive and so bloody that it effectively meant the government had financed the extermination of a population group that didn't exist, paying premium prices for a phantom enemy while the real enemy stripped the land bare. The piles of dried skin and hair that had been stored in the warehouses were not evidence of a military victory, they were the receipts of a colossal swindle where the state had been the willing mark. As the realization dawned on the horror-struck auditors, the true source of the extra scalps became undeniable, confirming the darkest whispers that had been circulating in the remote cantinas of the frontier. The discrepancy could only be explained by the systematic murder of the local Mexican peasantry and the friendly agricultural tribes whose hair was indistinguishable from the Apache. The government realized with a sickening jolt that the gold coins they had handed over to men like Kirker had been used to incentivize the slaughter of their own tax base. Every peso spent on defense had actually been an investment in self-destruction, funding a predatory machine that consumed the very citizens it was theoretically designed to protect. The state had not been fighting a war, it had been paying for a slow-motion, decentralized civil war where the mercenaries were the only winners. The economic impact of this revelation was catastrophic, as the region had been depopulated of its most vital resource, the labor force required to work the mines and the haciendas. Vast swathes of the countryside lay fallow and silent, the fields overgrown with weeds because the men who should have been harvesting the corn had been harvested themselves for the bounty on their heads. The silver mines, the lifeblood of the Mexican economy, struggled to operate as the workforce had either been killed by the scalp hunters or had fled to the mountains to live like fugitives, terrified of the civilized men who roamed the valleys. The Fifth Law had achieved the exact opposite of its intended purpose. Instead of securing the frontier for settlement and commerce, it had turned the territory into a ghost land, a graveyard of ambition where the only booming industry was death. The psychological scar left on the collective consciousness of the region was even deeper than the economic wound, shattering the social contract between the people and their government. The survivors in the ravaged villages learned a brutal lesson, that their lives were worth less to the state than the skin on top of their heads, and that their leaders were willing to monetize their existence if it served a political narrative. This betrayal created a deep-seated distrust of authority that would fester for generations, a cynicism born from the knowledge that the soldiers sent to save them were just as likely to skin them if the price was right. The legend of the Apache Terror was permanently complicated by the memory of the white and mestizo hunters who killed with a greed that no tribe had ever possessed. As for the mercenaries who had carried out this grisly work, they did not face tribunals or execution squads, for the government was too complicit and too embarrassed to prosecute them. Instead, the heroes of the scalp war simply dissolved into the vastness of the American frontier, drifting north to follow the gold rushes or scattering into the lawless territories of Arizona and New Mexico. They took their blood money and reinvented themselves as sheriffs, ranchers, or prospectors, their past crimes washing away in the amnesia of the expanding West. They left behind no monuments, only a silence in the desert where villages used to be, and a dark legacy that would be whispered about in the folklore of the borderlands for a century to come. The ultimate tragedy of the Fifth Law was the revelation that civilization, when stripped of its moral compass and driven by pure market forces, is capable of savagery that far outstrips the barbarism of any indigenous tribe. The Apaches fought for territory, for survival, and for revenge, but they never turned killing into a commodity with a standardized price list and a bureaucratic infrastructure. It took the sophisticated machinery of a modern state, with its legislatures, treasuries, and legal statutes, to transform murder into a banal administrative process. The horrifying efficiency of the scalp market proved that when a society decides to put a cash value on human life, it invites a darkness that will eventually consume the buyer as surely as it consumes the victim. In the end, the story of the scalp hunter serves as a grim tombstone for the era, a reminder that the line between the lawman and the psycho killer is often nothing more than a government badge and a line item in a budget. The audit of 1849 remains one of the most damning documents in the history of the Americas, a cold numerical proof that the greatest monster on the frontier was not the men with the tomahawk, but the men with the ledger. The wind that blows through the Sierra Madre today still carries the dust of the forgotten, a haunting testament to the time when the hair of a child was worth 100 pesos, and the soul of a nation was sold for fool's gold.